Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for session 2 of the Iscia seminar series on games and play. It's wonderful to see some returning participants from our first session, as well as new faces joining the conversation today. And today's session is titled Somaterapia, hope I have that right, an anarchist politics of infinite play. And we're delighted to welcome our presenter, Aragorn Eloff. Aragorn is a postdoc researcher in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Pretoria. His work sits at the intersection of philosophy and science, with a particular focus on the life sciences, neuroscience, and the study of psychedelics, which he examines primarily through the philosophy of Deleuze, Guattari, and Simondon. He also works in anarchist thought, earth and animal liberation, and critical algorithm studies. In this presentation, Aragorn will draw on Deleuze's discussion of the game of dice, indifference and repetition, to think about human and divine modes of play, and then bring those ideas into conversation with Somaterapia, a radical Brazilian therapeutic practice developed to support activist movements and grounded in an open-ended politics of individual and collective liberation. Aragorn will be speaking for around 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for discussion and questions. But in the meantime, please feel free to post questions in the chat as we go, and we'll gather them for the Q&A. Otherwise, let me not hold you up any further. Aragorn, thank you so much for being with us today, and I'll now hand over to you.
Okay, cool. Thanks so much for inviting me again. I think this is like my third time doing one of these seminars, and I really love them. So I'm really happy to be back. I'm just going to share my screen. Let me see if I can get this right. Okay. So you should be seeing the first screen of my slideshow. Is that what's happening?
Yes, yes.
Okay, cool. Okay, so I'm going to go a little bit backwards because I think in my little synopsis, I said I was going to speak about difference and repetition and the dice game, and then I was going to link it to this thing called Somaterapia. But what I want to do is start off by talking about what Somaterapia is, and then draw out some of the philosophical and ethical implications of that. But the way I thought I'd ground the conversation is in fact in the idea of microfascism. And this is famously something that Deleuze and Guattari talk about in Anti-Oedipus. In fact, if you read Michel Foucault's introduction to Anti-Oedipus, he speaks about how you can view the book as an introduction to the non-fascist life, and about how the practice of schizoanalysis that they develop in Anti-Oedipus is in fact a kind of radical way of disentangling ourselves, not just from macro-fascism, from the kinds of fascism that we see in the political world around us today again, but from micro-fascism too, right? So these kinds of more subjective, interpersonal, and subtle ways in which fascism determines the ways we relate to ourselves and each other, right? So in Anti-Oedipus, Deleuze and Guattari aren't just interested in how do we combat political fascism, the fascism of Mussolini, the fascism of Trump in our day, but just the fascism of how we treat each other and how we treat ourselves and how we treat the natural world, right? And one of the ways Foucault describes this in his introduction is that it's easy to be anti-fascist on the molar level, right? So on the level of sort of organized society, and not to see the fascist inside yourself, which you nurture with molecules both personal and collective, right? And in Anti-Oedipus, there's a lot of time spent looking at the ways in which the personal and the collective are always entangled with each other, right? Nothing is purely subjective and nothing is purely social. These two things both represent different aspects of the same flows and arrangements of desire. So when we're grappling with fascism, we're necessarily grappling with something that's a personal and collective arrangement, something that's macro and micro at the same time, right? And one of the ways in which Deleuze and Guattari draw this out is they speak about the difference between desire and interest, right? Obviously, the analysis of desire is a huge part of Anti-Oedipus. And usually when we think of desire, we think of something more like what they describe as interest. Interest is the way you describe yourself and your values and your ethics and stuff. So if I say that, I'm a good leftist and I have egalitarian social values and I'd like to live in a world of free equals and so on and so forth, I'm describing myself at the level of interest. These are my conscious interests that I have in the world. And I can express them in terms of things I want and don't want. So it sounds very close to the notion of desire. But desire for Deleuze and Guattari is something different to that. It's not the stuff that describes my being on the level of conscious apprehension. Instead, it's more something like the equivalent of the unconscious, except that for Deleuze and Guattari, they don't believe in a kind of symbolic or Lacanian or Freudian unconscious. For them, the unconscious is an arrangement of desire. It's what they call a machinic unconscious. So on the level of interest, I can say that I have all these values and all these sort of normative things that I align myself with in the world, right? My identity, essentially. But that might be very different to how my desire is arranged. My desire might manifest in ways that are completely counter to my interest. So on the level of interest, I can be a good anti-fascist, but on the level of desire, I can quite easily perpetuate a kind of micro-fascism in the way I relate to myself, in the way I relate to others, in the way I live my life, right? So one of the ways in which Deleuze and Guattari speak about this is in terms of a distinction they make between subjugated groups and group subjects. And they get this from Sartre originally. Sartre had this sort of notion of subjugated groups. I can't remember, he called it self-directed groups in fusion and serial groups caught in cycles of dead repetition, right? Guattari picks up on this idea and then it gets developed in Anti-Oedipus. But essentially the difference between a subjugated group and a group subject is that a subjugated group kind of structures itself dogmatically. It structures itself typically around an institutional object that isn't called into question. So if the subjugated group is a good Marxist-Leninist group, then Marxism-Leninism becomes that institutional object which the group is structured around. And that's never questioned, right? That's a kind of transcendent object. It's outside of the scope of interrogation. So subjugated groups are defined, this is what Guattari will say, subjugated groups are defined from the outside, right? They're not self-determined. They're passively structured. So in Nietzschean language, we'd say that they're sort of reactive. So a subjugated group also tries to perpetuate itself for its own sort of reasons, right? So instead of recognizing the provisionality of the group, because groups come together and split apart all the time, a subjugated group kind of wants to keep itself going regardless of whether it's relevant, healthy, useful, thriving, or anything else. So that's why Guattari will say that subjugated groups get caught up in cycles of dead repetition because the group itself becomes this kind of ideological object that needs to be perpetuated. And so this is obviously the toxic, bad kind of group, right? And if we end up as individuals in these kinds of groups, even if those groups describe themselves with values that sound very egalitarian and liberatory, we can end up alienating ourselves from our capacities to live and thrive and be in the world, right? So this for Deleuze and Guattari needs to be distinguished from what they call group subjects. And a group subject isn't determined by the outside. It's not determined in the same way by some sort of transcendent ideological object. Instead, group subjects nurture the creative capacities of everyone within the group to manifest the group. So it's a kind of immanent expression of a collective subjectivity. In other work, Deleuze and Guattari will refer to this as machinic assemblages of bodies and collective assemblages of enunciation. So it's particular arrangements of desire within a group context that allow for a creative, immanent unfolding of a collective subjectivity. And this kind of group recognizes its own provisionality. So a group subject might emerge around a particular sort of political or experimental or existential task. And once that task is complete, once the reason for that group has been fulfilled, the group is able to dissolve, right? It doesn't need to keep itself going on just for the sake of going on, right? It's not grounded in some sort of transcendent thing that cannot be interrogated. So, subjugated groups and group subjects. obviously, if you're combating fascism in the way that Deleuze and Guattari, and by extension Foucault, describe it, then you want to arrange your anti-fascist practices around a kind of group subject, right? If that lapses into a subjugated group, then you're just going to be reproducing fascism on a more subtle level. So this idea of constructing a healthy group subject is very, very key to the anti-fascist project as it's described in Anti-Oedipus and elsewhere, right? So I think the other thing to bear in mind is that we need to cultivate this kind of healthy group subject. And we need to remember that for Deleuze and Guattari, desire is immediately both social and subjective. And when you bring those two things together, then you have the sort of grounds for what they describe as the schizoanalytic project, right? And for them, schizoanalysis is actually very simple. I mean, they spend the whole last chapter of Anti-Oedipus describing it in very complicated language. But schizoanalysis is essentially just a project of trying to determine how your desire has been arranged and arranging your desire otherwise, right? So typically, for Deleuze and Guattari, your desire has been arranged in a certain way because of various political, structural, and existential dynamics. And all of those things are entangled with each other, right? So your desire has been arranged in a particular way because of capitalism, for instance. Your desire has been arranged in a particular way because of the state, right? And because of the entanglement of those two things. And so when you're interrogating the ways in which your desire has been arranged, you're confronting both subjective existential forces and political forces, right? So this is what they call the first task of schizoanalysis. It's about trying to unravel the ways in which your desire is currently arranged. And that might involve a destructive practice. It might involve getting rid of that arrangement temporarily so that you have the space to experiment with new arrangements of desire, right? In other work, I've spoken about this in the context of psychedelics. Psychedelics often loosen habituated modes of thinking, living, and being so that you can contract and experiment with other modes of thinking, living, and being. So psychedelic schizoanalysis would be kind of dissipating all the sort of usual habits that you've cultivated over a life, which no longer necessarily serve you well, and then entering into a space where it's possible to explore other habits, right? To arrange your desire differently. But there are many forms that schizoanalysis can take, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be psychedelics. And in fact, Deleuze and Guattari, in later work, when they talk about the creation of the body without organs in 1,000 Plateaus, they're quite wary of psychedelics, right? They're ambivalent about whether or not that's a wise approach to schizoanalysis or what they call the creation of the body without organs. So schizoanalysis is actually, if you think about it, it seems to be kind of a key part of creating a group subject and of combating fascism, right? If you're not interrogating how your desire has been arranged, then you're just reproducing all the norms that have been inculcated into your subjectivity and into the world in which that subjectivity is located, right? Into the sort of political and social world that you participate in. So all these things are caught up in each other, right? The creation of group subjects, schizoanalysis, the arrangement of desire, combating fascism, they're all part of the same practice. They're all aspects of the same practice. And one of the sort of crucial things to bear in mind here is that one of the ways we usually think about both politics and group practices and analysis and therapy and all these kinds of things is we tend to think of them as involving discourse and interpretation and all these kinds of practices that can be grounded in language and meaning and symbols and so on. And that's not totally absent in Deleuze and Guattari. It's not totally absent in schizoanalysis, but it's not the focus. Instead, the focus is about pre-linguistic, embodied, pre-subjective practices, right? Deleuze and Guattari will often talk about things like larval subjects, or in terms of flows and dynamisms and processes and intensive unfoldings. There's a lot of different language they use to talk about how we experiment with this kind of machinic arrangement of desire that's only secondarily translated into language and symbolic thought and all these kinds of things at the level of interest. So schizoanalysis also entails locating practices that are able to operate at the sub-individual level, right? As part of these processes of the unfolding of larval subjectivities, as part of what in other work they'll call individuation, right? So, as Wilhelm Reich puts this, life works beyond verbal ideas and concepts. This is all very interesting so far. There's this practice of schizoanalysis, there's an interrogation of the way our desire has been arranged, there's the idea that we can cultivate a healthy kind of group subject in order to combat fascism by looking at this desire through schizoanalysis, but it's all very abstract, right? And for me, I've been kind of reading and thinking about this stuff for a long time, and I've always tried to think of examples of it. So I'm always fascinated by the idea of schizoanalysis and how do we actually practice this, right? It sounds really cool. There's a lot of really poetic language to talk about it, but what does it actually look like in practice? And one of the things I came across early on was obviously the use of psychedelics, and I've spoken about that elsewhere a lot. But there's another really interesting practice that I came across the first time I went to Brazil, which was about 15 years ago. And I was traveling through Brazil, filming a documentary on anarchism. And part of that involved meeting up with lots of different anarchist groups and living in radical spaces, what are called ateneos, so sort of squats and radical anarchist houses where groups of anarchists live and experiment together and work on sort of anti-capitalist projects and so on and so forth. And one of the things that I came across that was quite prominent in Brazilian anarchist spaces was this practice of somaterapia. A lot of the groups that I hung out with there would tell me that they'd gone through somaterapia and that it had been very rewarding for them. It had allowed them to enrich their sort of group subject. They didn't use the language of group subjectivity, but it allowed them to strengthen the ties of the group while enriching the lives of the individuals within the group. So instead of perpetuating a subjugated group, it seemed to me that this idea of somaterapia allowed for the cultivation of a healthy group subject. And the more I learned about somaterapia, which is just Portuguese for somatherapy, so body therapy, right? Except if you look for somatherapy in English on the internet, you're going to find a sort of random new age sort of health and wellness practice, which I don't know whether it's good or bad, but it's not somaterapia. Somaterapia is something that's unique to Brazil, and it's unique to anarchist spaces in Brazil. So the more I learned about somaterapia, the more I realized that this was a profoundly schizoanalytic practice in all sorts of different ways. And I want to give you a little brief overview of what somaterapia in fact is, so you can see just how informed it is by the same notions. And what's profound in all of this is that Roberto Freire, so he's the guy on the right being arrested by probably the Brazilian police during the dictatorship in the 1970s. He's the guy who originated somaterapia. He wasn't familiar with Deleuze and Guattari at the time. He wasn't reading Anti-Oedipus. So he derived a lot of concepts that resonate very closely with schizoanalysis, kind of from first principles, engaging with a little bit of the same sort of stuff within radical therapy, but grounding his work in his own experiences of being part of leftist and activist groups in Brazil, combating fascism, combating the dictatorship. So Freire was a lifelong activist and a lifelong anarchist, and he was imprisoned by the Brazilian dictatorship many times. He spent about 12 years in jail. He was blinded in one eye from torture. He had a really sort of traumatic time in prison. And while he was in prison, he had a lot of time to reflect on what had gone wrong in all the activist movements he'd been part of. And what he realized is that on the level of interest, on the level of conscious ideology, the people that he'd formed these anti-capitalist and radical and anarchist anti-fascist groups with had expressed good values. They'd seemed to want an egalitarian liberatory world, right? They had the language to describe this. They seemed to adhere to all these sort of norms and values that aligned with anti-fascism. But on the level of desire, what Freire noticed is there was a lot of toxicity. There was a lot of sort of like micro-fascism that emerged, right? Again, this is not his language. He doesn't use this language at all. But what Freire essentially noticed is that there was this more sort of subterranean, unconscious dynamic that often emerged within groups that destroyed those groups and alienated the people within them and encouraged the formation of hierarchies and oppressive modes of interpersonal conduct and so on. So he was very interested in this. And while he was in prison, he started reflecting on like, how could he develop practices that would combat this, combat the emergence of these oppressive dynamics within groups that regarded themselves as radical and liberatory. He also spent some time hanging out with the Living Theatre. And I don't know if anyone's familiar with the Living Theatre, but they were an anarchist theatre troupe from the US who toured around a lot in the 60s and 70s. And they produced a lot of very sort of like encounter-based and anti-hierarchical theatre, which included a lot of sort of group practices, experiments with group space, experiments with subverting the norms of relation between people within these sort of contexts. So he was very influenced by this. He was also influenced by Gestalt therapy. He was influenced by a lot of the anti-psychiatric work at the time, so stuff like R.D. Laing, David Cooper, Thomas Zaz. And he was also influenced by anarchism. As I said, he was a lifelong anarchist, so he wanted something that was non-hierarchical and that was explicitly anti-state, anti-capitalist, and opposed to all relations of hierarchy and domination. And he was very, very interested in the practice of capoeira Angola. So some of you are probably familiar with capoeira. It's a unique thing that's a kind of mix between a martial art and a dance and play and music. It combines features of all of these. And capoeira comes from slave communities in Brazil who were trying to practice modes of resistance and modes of community building within the context of being freed slaves, but often in ways that they couldn't draw too much attention to. So capoeira Angola was constructed as playful and game-like, but it contained these very real exercises of self and collective liberation and lots of sort of very basic physical exercises to train the body and train the mind. So what happens is Freire comes out of prison and he starts promoting this practice of Somaterapia. And it's grounded in all of these things, right? Somaterapia typically lasts for about 18 months. People participate in about 30 weekly sessions during this time. Sorry, they participate in weekly sessions and they do about 30 different exercises during this time. And these exercises are a strange sort of mix of capoeira and trust exercises. So people will kind of run around the room trying to spank each other on the butts, or people will hold each other over the edge of cliffs, or people will kind of fall back and be caught by the people standing behind them. A lot of it's very simple. It's just a whole bunch of very sort of simple but cathartic trust exercises. And what comes up in these exercises quite often is very intense embodied reactions. So it'll be a very simple exercise, like you sort of loosen your limbs and you fall back and your friends in the Somaterapia group catch you and they start carrying you around the room, and you've kind of surrendered yourself to the trust of the others around you. And people will start shaking and crying and feeling nauseous and getting headaches, and traumatic experiences will well up, and all sorts of like very profound stuff that is unexpected kind of emerges from these very simple embodied exercises. So then what happens is the group will sit around and they'll talk about this and say, well, what came up for you? But it's not just about interpreting it. It's not about a psychoanalytic engagement. And it's not about, well, is it your relationship to your mother that resulted in you shaking when we carried you around the room? Instead, it's an experimentation with the embodiment that came up and then practicing different forms of embodiment to see if that moves your subjectivity in a different way, right? So what this is all based on is Roberto Freire was reading the books of Wilhelm Reich. And Wilhelm Reich wrote a very famous book called The Mass Psychology of Fascism. This was very influential for Deleuze and Guattari as well. When they talk about the relationship between desire and fascism, they get a lot of it from Wilhelm Reich's work. And Wilhelm Reich talks about muscular armor. He talks about how we embody the oppression we encounter in the world, literally in our posture, in our sort of somatic sensibility, in our physical phenomenological being, right? At the very core of our interoceptive, proprioceptive, haptic sort of encounter with the world and ourselves, we embody structures of hierarchy and domination. We embody oppression. We embody all these dynamics from the broader world around us. And those can manifest in all sorts of strange ways, right? In stooped posture, in weird aches and pains, in headaches, in twitches, in just the ways in which we carry ourselves and experience ourselves on a bodily level, right? And the way Freire talks about this is he talks about this as a kind of armoring that needs to be loosened up through all these exercises in order that tessao can flow. And tessao is a very strange word. It's got a very quirky translation. So the first time I Googled this and translated it, I laughed a little bit because the translation that Google gives you is horniness, right? So it's got the sexual connotation. But tessao in Portuguese has a wider range of meanings. And it means something like a libidinal energy, like a transformative energy. And it's very, very similar to the notion of desire in Deleuze and Guattari. The only difference would be that tessao in Freire is a little bit more similar to Wilhelm Reich's notion of orgone energy. And it's sort of this free, sort of universal energy that Deleuze and Guattari are actually quite opposed to, because they always want to think about desire as arranged in a particular way. They don't like this notion of inchoate, free-flowing energy. They want to think in terms of arrangements. But we can think about tessao in the same way, right? Tessao is arranged in a particular way in our embodied subjectivity and in our embodied collective encounters, in our individual and group and political and social arrangements, right? Those are all particular arrangements of tessao. And we need to be able to arrange those differently in order to loosen our armor and to liberate ourselves from these embodied modes of hierarchy and domination, right? Fascist modes of embodiment in the world. And so in Somaterapia, there's a famous sort of slogan, sem tessao, naha salotsao. Without tessao, there's no solution, which I usually just translate as without desire, there is no solution, right? If we're not interrogating the ways in which our world and ourselves and our subjectivities have been structured at the level of desire, we're not necessarily going to be able to combat fascism. So we can't just operate at the level of interest, we need to be able to operate at the level of desire, right? So you can already see how Somaterapia is a very schizoanalytic practice, right? So João de Mata, who's one of the contemporary trainers of Somaterapia, talks about it as a therapeutic pedagogical work that redimensions individual behavior and constructs freer and less hierarchical forms of sociability to increase the possibilities of individual and collective struggle against neurotizing mechanisms in the world, right? And those neurotizing mechanisms would be fascist, oppressive, alienating modes of structuring society, right? Subjugated groups. So the one other very interesting concept within Somaterapia is that they speak about all this in terms of what they call heteroregulação and autoregulação. And those just mean heteroregulation and autoregulation. So heteroregulation would mean you're regulated from the outside, and autoregulation would mean you're regulated from the inside, right? You're autoregulated. Very similar to the concept of autopoiesis in Francisco Varela and Humberto Maturana's work. But this was striking for me when I started translating, because none of the Somaterapia literature is in English. So I kind of have translated a lot of the books using Google Translate. And I was struck by the fact that these terms are so similar to the language that Guattari uses to speak about subjugated groups and group subjects. So to be regulated from the outside, remember, is how the subject group is regulated. It's regulated, the subjugated group, sorry, it's regulated by a transcendent object outside of itself. Whereas the group subject is self-regulated, it's immanently regulated. So it's auto-regulated. So it's fascinating that Somaterapia, Freire and his co-practitioners have come up with this incredibly similar set of practices and analyses of group dynamics, yeah, from first principles, essentially. So the one important thing to bear in mind, though, is that often when you talk in this way, if you talk about heteroregulation and autoregulation, autoregulation can often seem like the sort of like Enlightenment, humanist, liberal, individual subject, right? Foucault's kind of entrepreneur of the self. But the way to rather look at it, and remember, Freire is an anarchist, right? So he believes in a society of free equals. He believes in collective practices. Is that autoregulation is the same as what in Latin American activist circles is called autogestal, which just means self-management. It means collective self-management. So radical workplaces, self-organized workplaces in Latin America often describe themselves as autogestal, as auto-regulated, right? So autoregulation is not some sort of like individual, rational, bootstrapping Enlightenment subject. Instead, it's a necessarily collective subject, right? We're imbricated with the world and the world is entangled with us. Our flows of desire, our arrangements of desire are necessarily immediately both social and subjective, personal and political, right? So that's very important for thinking about this auto-regulation. So in practice, this all looks very simple, right? It's the set of all these simple embodied exercises combined with a little bit of analysis and conversation and political inquiry. And what's very important about Somaterapia is that it's an inactive practice. It doesn't want to think about oppression in the abstract. It doesn't want to think about fascism in the abstract. It doesn't want to just sit and chin stroke about this or write a bunch of polemic about it or only think on one level of subjective arrangements. It doesn't just want to think in terms of desire. It doesn't just want to think in terms of interest. It doesn't want to think just in terms of our conscious sort of apprehension of the world. It wants to think of the entanglement of all of these things, right? The functioning of life from the whole of that life. So it's not a reductive practice. Somaterapia is about the whole subject, the whole body, the whole self, and the whole group subject, right? It's about autoregulação, auto-regulation, collective self-arrangement of desire. Okay. And it's a very, as you can see, it's an incredibly playful practice. It's an incredibly sort of game-like practice. Most of the exercises are forms of play, right? It's people running around the rooms and pushing each other in playful ways and carrying each other around and doing kind of silly things. And there's something about that, something about the catharsis of that, about the sort of like lightheartedness of these sort of like atypical forms of interpersonal encounter. And there's a very beautiful way Freire puts it in one of his Soma handbooks. Soma allows us to become ready to act and react satisfactorily to natural and social stimuli, allowing us to perceive and express feelings and emotions. Soma makes us create, love, play, fight for the simple and enchanted pleasure of being alive. Awareness in this broad concept of life pulsating in time and space, in the duration and rhythm of each being, which would represent what produces in us our essential desire pleasure, freedom. And it's interesting that he uses that sort of like connected term of desire pleasure, right? Pleasure is more what we think of in terms of the level of interest in Deleuze and Guattari. So this entanglement of desire and pleasure, of desire and interest, is kind of where Somaterapia intervenes, right? Again, in terms of the whole subject. And, you know, I was so struck when I was hanging out with all these anarchist groups in Brazil, just how profoundly Somaterapia strengthened the groups, the group dynamic. People had like such rich modes of interaction with each other. They seemed much more sort of healthy in their own bodies. The groups often sustained a lot longer than other groups I encountered. There was something that allowed Somaterapia, there was something in Somaterapia that really fostered a deepness and authenticity of connection between participants that was manifested in these sort of anarchist groups and spaces. Okay, I just want to skip through a little bit because I see the time is starting to run out. But the last thing I'm going to say about Somaterapia, which is probably the most important thing, is that Somaterapia is not something you do for the 18 months and then, great, I'm done, I've liberated my desire, I'm living the anti-fascist life, I've completed schizoanalysis. You know, Deleuze and Guattari will famously say that there's no program of schizoanalysis. And Guattari will say that what we need instead is a continuous processual enrichment of life. And in exactly the same way, Freire will often speak about how, used to speak about, because he passed away a few years ago, but used to speak about how Somaterapia is a continuous practice, right? We're always experimenting and interrogating with the ways in which our desire has been arranged, right? We can feel that we've liberated ourselves from oppressive conduct, only for it to re-emerge in a different context, right? So we're never free forever. Freedom is a continuous practice, right? Both subjectively and politically. So all of this in turn, this is where I'm going to kind of start wrapping up. All of this in turn reminds me very, very much of the distinction Deleuze makes at the end of Difference and Repetition between these two different games that we can play, right? So, and I like to think of Somaterapia and the construction of subject groups and liberatory arrangements of desire through schizoanalysis as playing the second kind of game. Deleuze distinguishes between what he calls the human game and the divine game. And remember, he spent, well, not remember, but if you know Difference and Repetition, he spends a lot of the book talking about these entangled notions of difference and repetition. And he'll say that if we're being worthy to the unfolding of the world as it unfolds and the unfolding of ourselves as we unfold, then we have to be worthy of the new. We have to be worthy of the fact that what repeats is difference. The fundamental principle of repetition is a principle of difference. It's only difference that really repeats, right? There's a continual unfolding of newness in reality. And the more we try to hold on to sameness, the more we're playing the human game, the more we're trying to arrange the rules in advance and distribute chance in advance, and then apportion that chance between all the different throws of the dice within the game of life. But Deleuze will challenge this and say, if we want to play the divine game, which he also calls the child's game, then we have to accept that the whole of chance is caught up in every single throw because we're redistributing the rules and redistributing the whole of chance every time we throw. The rules are not predetermined, right? We're allowing for difference to enter into repetition when we play the divine game. And he uses Nietzsche's notion of the eternal return here to say that what returns is different. So if we take up Nietzsche's famous thought exercise of acknowledging and throwing ourselves into the eternal return, that the life I live now will repeat infinitely. That life that's repeating infinitely is the life of the unfolding of difference. It's difference that repeats. And the playing of the divine game is practicing the repetition of difference, being worthy of the event, as Deleuze says elsewhere. So this, to me, this idea of the divine game, of playing the child's game of dice, where the whole of chance is redistributed in every throw, with no criteria transcendent to that throw, is very much the same as this continuous practice that Freire talks about in terms of Somaterapia, right? That liberation, that freeing ourselves from all the binds of fascism, both macro and micro, entails this ongoing practice of schizoanalytic interrogation of the ways in which desire has been arranged and the ways in which we can arrange desire differently. This is a necessarily experimental, imminent, and open-ended practice where there are no norms we can rely on. There's no sort of dead index that we can latch ourselves onto and say, this is the transcendent criteria, this is the institutional object, right? Everything is up for grabs. Every time we throw the dice, all of that's being redistributed. So there's no pre-existing rules, since the game bears already upon its own rules, and since the child player can only win, all of chance being affirmed each time and for all times. And in case this is all kind of quite cerebral and, you know, the conclusion of difference and repetition is kind of scaling a bit of a cliff, what's kind of fascinating is that there's a little book that came out in the 1980s that's not very well known by James Carse. And it's a very accessible, it's not a philosophical book, it's a very accessible little book called Finite and Infinite Games. And he says very similar things to what Deleuze says at the end of Difference and Repetition, quite uncannily so. And he cites a couple of philosophers, there's a couple of ancient Greeks, he cites a bit of Heidegger, but he doesn't appear to be familiar with Deleuze at all. And yet the way he describes the difference between finite and infinite games, and you can find this book online pretty easily, it's so similar to what Deleuze is talking about with the dice throw. So here are a bunch of quotes from Finite and Infinite Games. Finite games are externally defined and infinite games are internally defined. The time of an infinite game is not world time, but time created by play itself. And this is a very key notion for Deleuze as well. The whole of Difference and Repetition, he talks about the syntheses of time and how spatiotemporal dynamics emerge from our participation. It's not just that we live in a sort of box universe that somehow is transcendent to our actions in the world, right? We're part of the unfolding of reality in our living and playing of ourselves. And this is also very key to Somaterapia. Somaterapia also talks about the sort of embodied natural flows of time within participation, within all these sort of subject groups. Carse will also talk about the fact that play is an event, that we're always confronted with these events that redistribute the rules, right? There are no boundaries. We're playing with the boundaries. We're not serious actors, because if we're serious actors, it means we've taken the script as transcendent, but instead joyful poets, right? Joyful poets because we're co-constructors of all of this. So we poetai, is what Carse calls it, right? It's very similar again to the concept of autogestal. We're poetai, inventors, makers, storytellers, mythologists, right? And we're not makers of actualities, and this is very Deleuzean again, but makers of possibilities, right? In Deleuzean language, this would be we're vice dictors or counter-actualizers. We're redistributing the virtual, redistributing the set of singular and ordinary points that describes the potentials that can be individuated into different provisional actualizations. Rearranging desire, right? To use a different language. So that's kind of where I want to leave it. I'm very interested to hear what people think about this practice of Somaterapia. And I have written a whole paper on it, and there is a wonderful little documentary online. You can just find it on YouTube called Soma and Anarchist Therapy. And yeah, I'd love to know what you guys think of this strange little practice that nobody knows. And when I say nobody knows about it, when I was in Brazil, again, a couple of years ago, I presented at this Deleuze conference to a bunch of Brazilians, and they didn't know about Somaterapia. The only two people in the whole audience that knew about it were two anarchists who'd done it. So even in Brazil, this practice, which is so Deleuzean and so schizoanalytic and so anti-fascist, isn't even really known to Deleuze scholars. So yeah, I'm really, to me, that's another very interesting aspect of Somaterapia, that it's remained so kind of obscure. And a lot of that is the exigencies of translation. There's very little about it in the Anglophone world. Most of it's just in Portuguese. But yeah, it deserves to be a lot more widely known. I think it's the most sort of most sort of profound schizoanalytic practice I've ever come across. And some Somaterapia, the last thing I'll say is that some Somaterapia practitioners do also look at using ayahuasca and other psychedelics as part of Somaterapia, but it's not sort of written into the official sort of guidebooks of how Somaterapia is conducted. So that's me. I've thrown the dice, and this is where we've ended up. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Aragorn. Indeed, I've never heard of the word. I've never heard of the concept. So it was a very fascinating presentation. I think every single person here learned something new. And I'm going to open the floor now. If there's any questions, we only have about 14 minutes or so for questions. So we can get that started as quickly as possible. You can either drop a question in the comment section in the chat, or you can just put your hand up. Yes, Jason.
Thanks so much. So thanks, Aragorn. That was very interesting, and it resonated with a bunch of things. I wanted to frame this in terms of, I always think of anarchists, and I suspect that, and very sympathetically, I suspect that this is a sign of my privilege, as fundamentally sort of utopian in teleological direction. And the reason I say that might be privileged is because there are real anarchists living real lives, but there's that angle. But there's a lot of sort of thought experiments that push this way. So I'm interested that you're saying that there was more endurance and sustainability in these collectives that practiced somaterapia. And it's resonating for me with a number of things. I've been just going over some Jonathan Haidt stuff about alienation and isolation, and the way that there's this pressure that can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. There's a loop that sort of late capitalist information society lets us get into kind of masturbatory, self-fulfilling loops of being satisfied with having our own attitudes presented to us. So I think it's very interesting to me that you're describing a sort of explicit, embodied cultural intervention that says, no, you're going to do fucking improv for the next 30 or 40 minutes or whatever. You're going to build it into your political praxis, and you're going to spend time being forced to interact with other people as part of the political praxis. And something that struck me about this, and this is where I loop back to the utopianism example, in the somewhat classic ecological utopian speculative novel Ecotopia, there's an idea of imagining what a sort of hippie-dominated breakaway Californian republic would be like. And one of the features of it was actual war games, that people would give in to the idea of venting their need to blow off the steam of being civilized by fighting each other with spears and accepting the chance of being injured by it. So that was a version of play which necessarily is not, it was cast as playful, but it was risky. And this takes me back to Jonathan Haidt saying children don't get enough risky play to learn how to feel confident in engaging with each other. So I'm interested in the idea that a sort of utopian direction in society could start with a praxis of adults engaging in risky improvisational play and saying that that needs to be an important part of everyday engagement to counteract being online and getting dopamine stimulation in limited ways that don't involve responding to others. So those were just a bunch of thoughts off the top of my head that related to that. But I hope it's of some use, that that's what resonated when I heard what you were saying, which was very interesting.
Amazing. Yeah. Okay. That's some rich stuff. There's a lot of rabbit holes I can go down. But
Sorry.
yeah, I mean, my two favorite two sort of bits of speculative fiction on anarchism are Ursula Le Guin's The Dispossessed, the subtitle of which is An Ambiguous Utopia, right? And another book by Starhawk, which is probably less well known, called The Fifth Sacred Thing, which is about the sort of like clash between dystopian and semi-utopian sort of societies in California in an era that looks uncannily like the contemporary world we find ourselves in now. There's others, there's Octavia Butler, there's a whole lot of other sort of speculative stuff about what liberatory societies would look like that I like for its nuance and for its lack of utopian thinking. So this is the interesting thing for me is that, so I'm a lifelong anarchist. I've been an anarchist since I was a teenager. It's the only sort of politics that's ever made sense to me. And I've always found anarchists quite cautious about the idea of utopian blueprints because, as you know, Emma Goldman and a lot of classic anarchists even will say, there's something quite authoritarian in asserting that a future society needs to look a particular way, right? So, I mean, I usually see that more in terms of like authoritarian socialism. So for me, Marxism, Leninism is the bad kind of utopianism. The way I think about anarchism's sort of perception of the possibilities of future society is something Guattari actually says. which is the only norm we need is the continual processual enrichment of life, right? And for me, that's the foundation of an anarchist politics. If you want to live in a liberatory society of free equals that's non-alienating, that's a continuous experimental practice, and it doesn't require any transcendent norms at all. It doesn't require a utopian blueprint. It doesn't require a particular arrangement of the social whole. It's necessarily game-like and creative and experimental and open-ended. I think that's why I've always found anarchism so appealing, is that it's what Deleuze and Guattari would call a diagrammatic politics, in the sense that it's not a map. It's just a sort of loose sketch of arrangements that we can actualize in various different ways. So yeah, I mean, I've written a bit about this. A lot of my earlier writing is about anarchism, but yeah, I think the key thing for me in all of this, in Somaterapia as well, is the open-endedness, right? The immanence, the provisionality, the fact that we're not hewing to any sort of like dogmatic or ideological transcendent norms. That for me is the foundation of any sort of liberatory politics.
I just want to shut up and let someone else speak, but I had a Parthian shot for you, which is that what this has been making me think of, this thought about alienation and such, is in No Future Without Forgiveness, Tutu has this line. He says, "There is a movement not easily discernible at the heart of things to reduce the awful centrifugal force of alienation, brokenness, division, hostility, and disharmony." And that came to mind when you mentioned Tessau as horniness, the idea of whereas more than horniness, but the idea of what do we call the movement that is counter to the awful centrifugal force that alienates us from one another. And I like the idea that there's an answer from a tradition, and it translates as a kind of libidinal energy to engage with each other. So that was just, as a Parthian shot, that is going to stick in my mind. So thank you very much.
Yeah. Well, one last thing I'll say on that as well, which is super important to me, is that, which I forgot to mention in the talk, is that one of the key things within Somaterapia is that there are sessions where the therapist is not present. So there's always a facilitator who's trained in facilitating Somaterapia, but there are lots of opportunities for the therapist not to be there so that the participants can engage as free equals without any sort of emergence of an authority figure. And that enriches group intersubjectivity, right? Because it's not arranging that subjectivity relative to an authority figure anymore. For me, that's super important. Yeah, it's tangentially related to what you said, but I think that's key for like enriched modes of experimenting with different ways in which we can relate to each other and experiment with each other, right?
Thanks very much, Jason. Aragorn, I'm going to ask you the last question we have time for today. Then put a comment in the chat box if you'd like to respond to that. A question in the chat box.
All right, I was reading it. I probably was half responding to it already because that's what I was reading when I was responding to Jason. But look, I think it's interesting. So a lot of people going to Somaterapia sessions would be people who are part of a political group already. They know each other.
Sorry, Aragorn, sorry to interrupt you, but could you just maybe just read the question or get Werner to talk to it? Otherwise, on the video, we just have a blank. Okay, and nobody knows what it is.
Right. So Werner's asking if Somaterapia has, as a precondition, a particular kind of relationship between the members undergoing Somaterapia, right? So what would that relationship be? Like, can it work between strangers, for instance? And yeah, so look, typically, or often at least, people are going to go into a group with some sort of relation between them. They might be part of the same sort of political space. Often they'll be anarchists, so they might know each other informally from sort of radical milieus. But you'll also have people who are coming in who don't know anyone else in the group, who are strangers. And there's something kind of interesting about that, right? Because you're letting yourself be sort of vulnerable to what Deleuze would call a shock to thought, right? Something I wanted to say to Jason as well is that risk, right? And the necessity of risk as part of a collective practice of liberation involves opening yourself up to the unthought, to the outside, to the shock to thought, to the unfamiliar, right? Making yourself vulnerable to the event. And So I think, yeah, it can work. Somaterapia can work between any kinds of arrangements between people, because it's experimenting with ways of subverting the relationships and modes of interpersonal conduct that have been inculcated into all of us by authoritarian and dominating social structures, right? And in subverting those, often these sort of like profoundly strange modes of authenticity emerge from within the group space. And in fact, this is not unique to somaterapia. Even normal group therapy, if it's facilitated well, can do this, right? Even a good psychedelic therapy encounter can do this. It allows that strangeness to come to the surface, that allows us to recognize how provisional the usual arrangements of our desire are, and all the other ways in which we can relate to ourselves and each other.
Thanks so much, Aragorn. I see that Ansel's just put a question in the chat. Ansel, if you just want to speak to the question, and then Aragorn can answer, and that would be our last question and answer for the day.
Hello. I'm sorry, I know we don't have a lot of time. I was just wondering, Aragorn, if you'd ever come across Sarah Pink's work. She writes about the place event, and it's kind of this like embodied, it's different to the space event. She looks at bullfighting. I just thought that maybe you would find it interesting. And I was wondering if it kind of adds to your argument with Deleuze and play. And then also, I just wanted to send you my email address because I met Greg at a conference last year and he told me to reach out to you.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, I mean, I'm not familiar with Sarah Pink's work, but I mean, I'm very interested in embodiment, and I usually speak about it through what's called enactivism, which is part of 4E cognition in cognitive science. So it's embodied, embedded, extended, and active. And enactivism thinks about our cognition, all our sort of subjective processes, as a set of sort of embodied practices, right? So we're enacting selves and worlds at the same time. A lot of it's based on sort of Merleau-Pontian phenomenology. And I've actually written about somaterapia in relation to enactivism. So yeah, you're welcome to email me and I'll share my paper with whoever's interested. But it's a very schizoanalysis and somaterapia, I view them as very inactive practices because they're necessarily embodied, they're necessarily unfolding, they're necessarily cultivating ongoing sort of modulations of the relations between selves and worlds. And yeah, for me, this is much more interesting than the sort of abstraction of sort of mainstream psychotherapeutic approaches where it's primarily about language and about sitting and talking about things. I think that's very useful often, but I think enacting and embodying and cultivating these embodied practices is just as important.
Thanks very much, Aragorn. Thank you for your enlightening presentation. After this, and it cools down a bit here in Gilbert, I'm going to be doing a lot of research. I had a few questions myself to ask you, but what I'm going to do is after this, I'm just going to email them through to you. And that would give me a chance to get my answers from you as well. But thank you everyone for joining us today. We will see you next week, same time, same place, and we hope that you have a fantastic weekend. Andrea, is there anything you want to say before we end off?
No, just thanks so much for a very, very interesting talk. And looking at some of those pictures there, I was just thinking, I'm not going to be throwing myself into the hands of a whole bunch of people. I'm not going to trust them to, what do you call it, catch me or dangle me over a cliff. Forget it. So it was kind of interesting. I was thinking about that feeling of vulnerability and that, yeah, sometimes people are just, I don't know, damaged, and you can't throw them over, over a whole bunch of hands. So it would be interesting that to think about the people who can't participate in that, and I'm sure that there must be other ways for people to play. I like playing with language myself, to be honest. But yeah, very interesting. And I also have 1,000 questions. What we can do as well is I will post the video on YouTube, and you could post questions and answers there too in the response thing. So there'll be all sorts of different ways of keeping contact. If anyone wants to contact Aragorn and doesn't have his email, just drop me an email and I will send it on. Okay, but thank you. Thanks, Jenna, and thanks, Aragorn. And yeah, have a great playful weekend.
Thanks so much.